Content warning: this film contains descriptions of sexual coercion, forced inspection, and the institutional control of enslaved women's bodies. The script avoids graphic detail and uses trauma-informed language. Please take care as you listen. She stepped from the dirt toward the wide porch, bare soles leaving faint prints in the cool night. Oil lamps guttered, throwing the big house's white columns into sudden, long black lines. Around her, shadowed figures shifted, some bent with age, others standing too straight as if to hold themselves immune to what would come. Her hands were slightly damp. She had tucked them under the fold of her skirt, palms pressed to her belly as if that pressure could steady the air itself. This is the ritual of submission that enslaved women faced before serving in the Big House, 1832. A night scripted not for her dignity, but for property. It begins at a threshold and ends with the sealing of ownership over her flesh, her capacity to bear children, and the labor those children would later supply. It is a procedure owned by law and custom, carried out with witnesses and ledgers, with the state's silence folded into the plantation ledger as neatly as accounts of corn and cotton. Where are you listening from? Drop your city in the comments. This story crosses borders, but it always arrives in bodies. They called such nights preparations, inspections, or in ledger shorthand, condition verified. Contemporary words soften what was being done. Archival fragments show that owners meant to make women's bodies legible to markets and to the law. Records, sales lists, overseer notes, occasional midwife memoranda reveal the logic even where they do not narrate the faces. Enslaved people were cataloged alongside horses and hogs. Reproductive capacity had a price. Pregnancy increased economic value for some classes of owners. It threatened family bonds for others. What that meant on specific plantations varied, but the pattern is clear. Sexual and reproductive surveillance were woven into the economic and legal fabric of slavery. The law recognized the holder's interest. Courts and statutes did not treat an enslaved woman as a citizen, but as a unit producing value. In practice, that logic justified procedures intended to control and document her fertility and her availability for domestic labor or breeding. Some written accounts, letters from planters, notes from abolitionist investigators, and rare midwife entries describe examinations, witness attestations, and transfers recorded in ledgers. They do not compose a single uniform ritual across the South. Yet archival fragments, taken together, reconstruct a pattern. Owners and overseers used a mix of ceremony, coercion, and medical authority to stabilize claims over women who were their property. She had walked this way before, but never to this door at night. On the river plantations and inland farms she had known, nights of calling and counting were ordinary. An owner's summons, a clerk's ledger, the overseer's thin boot tapping the porch planks. This night felt different, purposeful. A murmur went through the cluster of witnesses. The house matron had come down from her chamber, the plantation doctor had been sent for, and the overseer's lantern bobbed like a second sun. Her mother, who had come with a small few allowed to accompany, had cupped her face, pressed something hard into her palm. The word was not spoken aloud, but the pressure of her fingers said all that could not be printed in the account books. She felt the hush tighten like a band around her. A child of the quarters, she knew the rules. Refusal invited punishment, and resistance could mean sale. Compliance carried its own horrors, but also a calculus of survival. Maintaining proximity to kin, keeping small favors, staving off the worst dispersals. There was no consenting in anything she had been offered. There were only degrees of endurance. A low voice from the porch, belonging to the house matron or the woman the household designated to enforce its domestic order, began to intone the steps. The words were formal, clipped. In plantations where a matron existed, she oversaw the household's rituals, the laying out of uniforms, the menial training of kitchen aides, the marking of newcomers. On that night, the matron took on a different tone, not of instruction in kitchen craft, but of enforcer of ownerly claims. The procession moved like a well-ordered list. A lantern bearer, the plantation doctor whose leather satchel smelled of tincture and tin, a clerk with ledger in hand, two field hands with faces turned away, refusing to meet her eye, and then the small knot of women, some kin, some tied to her by rumor or obligation. She walked last, as if the night required that the object of inspection be placed centrally and visibly under the law's gaze. The porch boards complained underfoot. From inside the house, a clock ticked a slow and indifferent count. They made her stand before the doorway, framed by the doorway itself as testimony to the claim. The owner, a man whose ledger entry would later buy and sell bodies like cattle, leaned back and watched. His presence at the threshold served two purposes. He declared the intent to control, and he acted as witness to the enforcement of that control. Owners sometimes performed this role in person. At other times, they delegated it. Where planters were absent, overseers and clerks filled the function, and the official business proceeded in their name. The matron was allowed to call the steps. In some account books, the matron's notes survive. A line about prepared, another about condition as required. Those words are clinical. They mask the coercion undergirding them. Tonight, the house matron's voice did not waver.
She instructed the midwife to begin, spoke for the owner and the overseer because in that time no other voice carried equal authority. The midwife arrived with a soft, sure calm that came from having seen so many who had no right to refuse. Midwives occupied an ambiguous place in domestic slavery. Some were enslaved women long practiced in delivering infants and tending illness. Some were white practitioners summoned for their supposed expertise. Their notes, when they survive, are sparse. Brief mentions of swelling, of favorably timed conception, of complications. Often, midwifery was one of the few realms where an enslaved woman could hold knowledge the owner could not fully command. Knowledge that was, paradoxically, also turned to the owner's profit when she was forced to attest to another woman's body. What followed was a set of acts that archival language will sometimes gloss as inspection. She was told to undress. The script of the night required visibility. The purpose was not intimacy, but legibility, to make her body narratable to the ledgers, to make any forthcoming pregnancy undeniable, to establish whether she was suitable for the roles the owner envisioned, wet nurse, house servant, or breeder. The words used in plantation papers, condition, sound, fit, translate into a brutal economy of meaning. To be deemed fit was to be declared productive. To be declared otherwise could be a sentence to the fields, to sale, or to the removal from family. This is where the ritual resembles a courtroom more than a household. Witnesses stood close, white overseers, the owner if present, and black witnesses compelled to testify. Their gazes, the account suggests, operated as evidence. Observations were filed with clerks. The plantation doctor, summoned for the authority of his notes, might make a short entry. No sign of pregnancy, or likely, or swollen. Such notes could determine futures. A notation that a woman was pregnant might increase her market value, alter the owner's license to control her movements, or mark her child as chattel from birth. We must be clear. The precise sequence of actions, who undressed, who examined, which tests were performed, varied by place and by power. There is no single script stamped across every plantation. What is documented in multiple archives, however, is a consistent logic. Surveillance administered through ritualized acts, performed in the presence of witnesses, recorded for legal and economic purposes. Where the record is thin, this account is deliberately reconstructed from patterns that historians identify across estate accounts, sale records, midwife notes, and testimony collected by abolitionists. These reconstructions are plausible, anchored in sources, but they are reconstructions. Her mother had whispered one last thing, what no ledger could tell. Those whispers exist in the human archive. Remembered gestures, a hand pressed into the small of a child's back, a mouth forming protective instructions that the written record can never capture. The needed choice for many of these women lay between the small safety of surviving another day and the risk of defiance. In the hush, she remembered a command from childhood: keep close, make small. Sometimes the only way to protect the ones you loved was to accept what was done to you. In the doorway, she saw the doctor's breath cloud in the lantern light, the sheen on his instruments catching a flash. He came close with a clinical language. Condition, he said, no evidence. Or sometimes the note read, suspected or immediate. These words supplied the plantation with a category it could use in contracts. Once the doctor wrote something into his pocketbook, the overseer would write it into the ledger. Once it was in the ledger, the owner could imagine futures, devise bargains, or move hands across state lines with the legal confidence that such notations offered. Witness testimony mattered less to justice than to property. A black witness forced to stand might be recorded by name. A white overseer's observation carried the weight of law. The ritual leveraged every unequal power in its favor. The matron's voice could be stern, but might also be a survival tactic. Some women within the household enforced these procedures because refusal would mean their own downfall. The moral judgment of those on the porch is complicated by the whole system's coercion, which extended into everyone's choices. But the effect was clear. A ritual not of mutual care, but of domination, dressed in domestic language. At the climax of the night, the essential thing the owner sought was verification. Not narrative, not tenderness, but evidence to which a ledger could lay claim. Some plantations used midwives' notes. Some used the presence of the owner's physician. Some relied on the statement of the overseer. The forms varied, but each performed the same function: converting a woman's body into a documented fact in the plantation's accounting system. This transformation was not only symbolic. It had legal and economic consequences. Child status, marketability, and the owner's ability to reproduce or sell assets at will. After the inspection, there was always a practical aftermath. The midwife might wash and dress her. The matron might instruct her to return to her duties. The ledger might gain an entry that would be quoted in later sales. Life outwardly resumed. Children still needed feeding. Porches still smelled of stew and smoke at dawn. But something inside that woman, if we may speak carefully of interiors, had been reframed by the rituals performed that night. A day or two later, a notation might appear in the overseer's book: condition verified, or no sign, fit for house service. Sometimes the owner added a more pointed line: assigned to big house, or not for sale. In other cases, a positive notation, an observed pregnancy, was treated as an increase in value. Pieces of paper transformed the fact of gestation into monetary language. Sales ledgers later might list the woman with a higher price, or the child with a line of parentage. These ledger lines survive in court filings and estate inventories. They are brutal, clerical acts that make a woman legible as a future source of profit. But the records have holes. The voices of the women who suffered these procedures rarely speak in the documents. Where we do find testimony, runaway narratives, rare freed persons accounts, and abolitionist interviews, we glimpse the deep costs: fragmentation of family, ongoing surveillance, and the mental labor of surviving under perpetual threat. In some narratives, women later remembered walking to the big house in the night for reasons that were not elective, recalling the smell of oil, the creak of the porch, the faces that watched. Those memories, when they appear, are treasured but rare. The historian's note, spoken plainly here and intended to appear on screen, matters.
What you have just heard is a reconstruction informed by archival evidence. Estate inventories, overseer accounts, physician pocketbooks, midwife notes, and testimonies collected in abolitionist sources. Some elements of the scene are documented in fragments. Others are assembled from patterns across multiple plantations and years. Where specifics for this single night in 1832 are uncertain, I have used historically plausible detail to render what the archival traces imply. This is not a claim that every plantation performed the same ritual. It is an effort to make an archival absence visible, to show how institutional logics produced repeated patterns of coercion. There were practical reasons for silence. Enslaved people were rarely the authors of the documents that governed them. When they did leave accounts, runaway narratives, petitions for freedom, their voices were often mediated by abolitionist editors or the legal apparatus. Owners' papers, by contrast, multiplied. The archival record therefore overrepresents the viewpoints of those who counted property and underrepresents the ones whose bodies were counted. The absence of testimony is not evidence of consent. It is often evidence of enforced silence. Even so, occasional sparks remain. A runaway notice will sometimes explain why a woman departed. Fearing sale, by force taken, or carried off to house to be delivered. Midwife journals occasionally note complications linked to coerced breeding or mistreatment. Abolitionist newspapers published interviews and accounts that, while mediated and sometimes edited, described forced inspections or the deliberate separation of mothers and infants. Taken together, these fragments point to a social reality in which ritualized inspection operated as a tool of control. The social logic that produced these rituals was reinforced by cultural practices and by openly transactional language. Owners spoke of condition and breeding in domestic letters, sometimes in the same sentences that discussed crop rotations. They wrote of the improvements made to estates and of stock with an ease that collapsed living bodies into property metrics. That linguistic ease normalized brutality. It turned what others might call violence into a line item. After the night, the household returned to its rhythms. Her hands cooked, repaired, soothed children. She served at table, performed menial labors, and walked among the columns of the big house that now watched her as a man watches his ledger. She carried within the knowledge of what had been done, but the world asked her to act as if nothing had changed. Enslaved communities developed their own codes of care. Quiet gestures, hidden songs, to hold memory and protect one another. Those codes survive in folklore and in oral histories gathered much later. They are acts of defiance against the very ritual that had tried to make them clinically knowable. What does it mean to name these practices rituals of submission? The word ritual acknowledges that the acts were repeated and structured. They mapped power into a sequence. A summons, a procession, visible witnesses, a medical or domestic inspection, and a ledger entry. Rituals invest the state and the household with a sense of order. They make coercion look ordinary. Calling them rituals does not neutralize their violence. It exposes how routinized cruelty becomes institutionalized. We must also pause to note whom we can see in the archive and whom we cannot. The ledger speaks the owner's truth. The midwife's note speaks in clinical shorthand. The runaway flyer tells a fractured story. The voices of the women who were inspected are often absent in their own words. That absence is a historical wound. We reconstruct their likely feelings, fear, shame imposed by a system that calls itself lawful, strategies to survive, not as fact, but as empathy guided by patterns of evidence and by the testimony of those who, later, told their stories. Across time and cultures, rituals of inspection and public humiliation have been used to mark certain bodies as property. Comparisons can illuminate structures without asserting identity between practices separated by centuries and regions. Scholars note, for example, that ancient empires used public ceremonies to mark social status. In antebellum America, the tools were different. ledgers instead of inscriptions, midwives instead of priests, but the effect of making bodies legible to power is a shared structural logic. These analogies help historians see patterns, but they must be used carefully to illuminate and not to conflate distinct histories. What, then, does the modern listener owe to these histories? First, attention. The material traces of these rituals are dispersed across estate inventories, midwife notes, and fragmented testimonies. The gaps matter as much as the surviving lines. Second, humility. We must acknowledge the limits of what ledgers tell us. Third, action. Honoring memory is not only archival curiosity. It can mean supporting projects that recover enslaved women's narratives, funding community archives, and teaching the complexity of these practices in classrooms so that future generations understand the mechanisms of control. Memory work also demands silence and listening. When descendants and communities seek to remember, they deserve space shaped by care. Archives that prioritize their claims, documentation that avoids sensationalization, and presentations that foreground dignity. Visual representation of these events should be handled with the same care. Silhouettes, implied gestures, archival documents, and expert commentary can convey what happened without re-traumatizing or eroticizing suffering. At the edge of the story, consider her now, back in the quarters. Hands that have cooked and that have tended children, eyes that have learned to read the porch for meaning. She leans against the post and thinks of the ledger entry that will list her as fit or condition verified. If the entry increases her market price, if a child is later listed with her as mother in an estate inventory, those lines will be cold proof that her body has been counted. That counting does not equal consent. Counting is the opposite of voice. In the broader sense, these rituals of submission are not ancient relics alone to be studied and set aside. They are part of a lineage of practices that normalize the surveillance and commodification of certain bodies. Their echoes persist in social structures and in ways we write and value human life. To confront them is to acknowledge the lingering harm. If you want sources and further reading, check the description. There you will find a short bibliography used to inform this reconstruction, including works by historians who have documented reproductive control and the economic accounting of enslaved people. Subscribe if you want more recovered histories and careful reconstructions that center survivors' dignity. She traces her fingertips over the thin scar on her palm, a small private mark that no ledger would ever record. Somewhere, in a chest of papers, in the brittle ink of a midwife's note, in the margin of an overseer's book, there may be a line that names what the owner wanted. But that line never captures the quietness of the woman's breath on the porch, the way she counted steps in her mind, the tiny rituals she invented to feel human. As the night dissolves into dawn, the big house keeps its white columns, the porch collects its steps, and the ledger grows by one more entry, one more verified fact. Outside the house, people still wake and gather, trade what little they may, keep children quiet. They sing, low and guarded, songs that stitch community together. The ritual has been performed. The system has marked another life for its uses. The archive will keep its fractions, and we must learn how to read the silences as carefully as the ink. Finally, we must allow the living to speak. Archivists, historians, and audiences together can help rebuild what has been erased. Support projects that digitize runaway narratives, fund oral history initiatives, and teach the complexity of these histories in public curricula. The ledger entries may persist, but so can acts of remembrance that center those whose bodies were reduced to value on a page. She steps back from the porch, pulling her shawl tighter, holding the secret of the night within, and moves toward the row of cabins where the day's work will begin. The big house remains. The ledger remains. What must change is how we reckon with both, the files in an archive and the living memory threaded through descendants and communities brave enough to say what was done. This account has tried to reconstruct a plausible scene grounded in archival patterns for the year 1832 on an antebellum plantation. Where specifics were uncertain, I have used historically informed reconstruction and signaled it as such. Sources and further reading are in the description for anyone who wants to study the primary documents and scholarship that informed this narrative. If this story touched you, share it with someone who will listen carefully, and subscribe if you want more histories that recover what has been hidden.